You're listening to episode 186 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Sir Lloyd Geering joins us to speak about trailblazing the secular path with secular Christianity in 1967. Hi, everyone. Before we get started with today's podcast, I want to remind the listeners that we started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes store search for Present Moment and look in the results in the Podcasts section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. We have a tendency in movements to think of ourselves as being particularly innovative, different, that our idea is such a paradigm shift it couldn't have come before. With secular Buddhism, though we've certainly seen a tremendous rise in at least naming our practice as such, we're not the first to take a secular approach to a religious tradition. Christianity has several decades ahead of us in that, and we're very fortunate today to have one of the icons of that secular movement as our guest. Sir Lloyd Geering holds a Doctor of Divinity from the University of Otago and a master's degree in mathematics. He was a Presbyterian minister and turned to theological teaching in 1956. In 1967, Sir Lloyd was charged with doctrinal error and disturbing the peace and unity of the Church. The case was brought before the 1967 General Assembly of his church and dismissed without much being discussed. Geering is a member of the Sea of Faith Network, New Zealand, and St. Andrew's on the Terrace, as well as principal lecturer at St. Andrew's Trust for the Study of Religion and Society. He was honored in 1988 as a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, and in 2001 as Principal Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. In the 2007 New Year Honours List, he was made a member of the Order of New Zealand. In 2009, his status as Principal Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit was redesignated to that of Knight Grand Champion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice lemon and pyroa, world famous in New Zealand. Our guest today is Sir Lloyd Geering. Sir Lloyd, welcome to The Secular Buddhist.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
So tell us a bit about your background in religious tradition.
Well, I'm a Presbyterian minister, and I didn't have a religious upbringing to any great extent at all. It was only when I was a student that I embraced the Christian faith seriously and very quickly decided to become train for the ministry. And I did that. I had 3 parishes, and then I moved from there into theological training itself, having specialized in Old Testament study. And I held chairs in the Old Testament in Brisbane for 4 years, and then for about 11 or 12 years in Dunedin. And during my period in Dunedin at Knox College, I became principal of the Theological College. And it was while I was principal that the disturbances arose, and namely that I was accused of teaching false doctrine and of disturbing the peace of the church. And there was what is commonly referred to today as a heresy trial. It's not true to say that the church tried me. Rather, my accusers accused me, and the General Assembly of the church acted as both the judge and jury hearing this. And the result of that was that I was acquitted, in the sense that it was said that no false doctrine had been established and that the case was closed. And I continued in theological teaching for about 3 years, but I recognized that the church had become somewhat divided between a conservative minority in those days and the majority. And so when the opportunity came to teach religious studies generally, I was really glad to take that. And so my last teaching post was as the foundation chair of religious studies at Victoria University. But I retired from that now over 30 years ago. And in some respects, my retirement period has proved the most fruitful of all, in that I've done a lot of teaching outside the academic institutions, though in the public area, not in the church really. And most of my writing has been done in that period. I wrote 2 books while I was still a theological teacher, but I've written about 8 or 10 since that time. So that's substantially where I stand so far as my career is concerned.
So let's explore a little bit that dispute in 1967. The people who were forwarding the complaint, what specifically was it that they were having problems with?
Well, the first thing was I wrote an article for the church magazine, the Easter magazine, on the resurrection. And I really asked the question, what do we really mean by saying Jesus rose from the dead? On the grounds that it couldn't possibly mean a bodily resurrection. That just doesn't make sense because if it were a bodily resurrection, he'd either be walking the earth to this day or had to take a space trip. And of course, that's just nonsensical. So I asked the question, meaning that it obviously was a metaphorical or symbolic expression to mean something. Well, that upset a great number of people in the church who had really taken the story of the empty tomb quite literally, where I said it was simply a pious legend which had grown out of the conviction of Jesus risen from the dead. So the whole church and to some extent society was caught up in this, but it more or less came to a reasonable kind of solution by the end of the year. And then it all broke out again the following year when I preached a sermon, actually it was a sermon on Ecclesiastes. And in the course of this sermon, I happened to say that, of course, we mortals don't have any immortal soul. We are mortals. That broke out in a great debate in New Zealand. Everybody was talking about whether there's life after death and so on. So that fueled more flames within the church. And that's how my accusers gathered strength to bring it to some sort of climax at the trial.
The trial itself concluded without too much fanfare, and they found you innocent. But what you've just said, that there's not a literal resurrection, and we Christians, for example, don't have immortal, unchanging souls, seems to go against Christian doctrine. So how did they navigate those waters? How did they get through that?
Well, of course, the Bible, it says that only God is immortal. And the idea of an immortal soul isn't in the Bible at all. It actually came into Christianity about the 2nd century, largely due to the influence of Plato. So it has certainly been part of traditional Christianity ever since that time, but not in 1st century Christianity. The Jews had no belief in any life after death. That is why they talked about resurrection. And the resurrection took place at the end of time, at the end of the world. And the idea of resurrection was in order to help people feel that in the long run, there is fairness in life. The doctrine of reincarnation in India arose for exactly the same purpose, but they, of course, solved the problem in a somewhat different way, and namely that you mightn't get justice in this life, but in the next life, that'll be ironed out to some extent. So the whole idea of resurrection was an interesting concept to try and assure people, or make people feel that in the end, morality does pay, that life does have some sort of fairness. Once one had reached the point where the general resurrection had not taken place, the first Christians thought it was just around the corner. And when it didn't happen in their own lifetime, they began to get concerned. And in order to meet that concern, they adopted the belief that came from Plato that really we have an immortal soul which survives the body anyway. And so traditional Christian doctrine is a bit of a mixture of two quite different concepts. One, a general resurrection at the end of time, and a life in a spiritual life in heaven in the meantime. Because traditional Christianity said that at the end of time, we will be resurrected from our graves and rejoined with our immortal soul from heaven, and will be judged all over again. As my theological teacher said, it's all a bit illogical. I mean, he's told me that 60 years ago. So it wasn't exactly new to me.
So it sounds like part of your defense in this situation was to back up what you were saying with the Bible itself, with their own religious scriptures.
Exactly so, yes. Yeah. Mind you can prove anything from the Bible, really. And the reason being that it wasn't written by one person, and it is I have a great respect for the Bible. It's a wonderful collection of documents, but of course they're ancient documents, and they're documents which testify to what people believed, more than 2,000 years ago. And the world has changed so much since then that if there's any truth at all in what the Bible said, it usually has to be reinterpreted to fit the context and the worldview in which we live today.
So I'm making a guess that having your story validated by the most authentic religious document, the Bible, within the Christian context, that might not have been so well received by the people who had brought you into that situation. How did they take that? Was this new information to them, or was this something that they just chose to ignore?
Well, it is funny that you raised that question, because I had two accusers, and these two accusers themselves couldn't agree. One of them was a fundamentalist layman who took every word of the Bible to be true. The other was a very well-educated minister who had a very good theological education, and he knew that he couldn't side with the fundamentalist on a whole lot of issues. So when they brought their charges, they brought them separately, and in a sense I was able to play one off against the other to some extent. And now, at the end of the trial, they were both disappointed. But the Presbyterian minister one, he just stayed in the church and then did his best and actually wrote some interesting books after that. Whereas the fundamentalist left the church and started a church of his own, which is what fundamentalists often tend to do.
Sir Lloyd, let's talk about just the word secular and what we mean by that. How do you approach the word secular?
Well, I approach the word secular from its original Latin meaning saeculum, which means this age or this period, this period in time, this world. And I'm sorry that it's so often regarded as the opposite of religious. I see the modern secular world simply as the logical continuation of Christendom, in which the values that have brought them of Christendom, which helped to bring the modern world into being, have reached the stage where they have thrown off the old supernatural concepts and see life as that which has to be lived within the limits and confines of this world, that is, between conception and death. Our genes may continue on in our later generations, but we as individuals are confined to one life. And so, in my view, this is what Christianity and indeed all the other religious traditions are all about, how to live this life. And so I don't see any conflict between accepting the secular world as it is and acknowledging what I've learned from our Christian past.
So shifting the focus of our conversation a little bit into society at large, what would you like to see change in how society views religious doctrine like this?
Well, first of all, I would like to help people see that the word religion is of much wider significance than the way it's understood in a popular sense. Usually when people think of religion, they are thinking of something supernatural, something that is altogether different from the natural world in which we live. Now, if you're going to confine religion to that aspect, then religion is completely outdated. There's no place for it in the modern world. But moreover, traditions like Confucianism and Buddhism are not religions either. And I had to, when I was teaching in religious studies, had to discuss what do we really mean by religion and to work out some kind of definition that covered everything. And in doing so, I came to the conclusion that I preferred, and these aren't my words, they're from a scholar, religion is a total mode of the interpreting and living of life. Now, each word is important. It's a total mode, so that it covers everything. It's right to the limits of life. And it's interpreting, that is, it's an attempt to understand it, and then having understood it, it's an attempt to live out, to respond, to make that response. Now, in this way of religion, I think people are just as religious today as they ever were. But religion has abandoned the concept of supernatural simply because that is really the science of the ancient world. That was the knowledge of the ancient world. We live in a world in which we recognize that there is only one reality, one physical reality. We have evolved within this. We've reached in our evolutionary journey, we've reached the point where we can think and understand and ask questions and try to give answers to those questions. And in asking questions and in answering them, that is really religious enterprise. So that it seems to me that all the great religious traditions of the past, as they come into this new global secular situation, may have something to offer to what I would call the global religion of the future. Now, atheists and humanists simply reject this definition of religion because they say it's too broad. Well, there's no use getting too caught up with what are really verbal debates. And I want to say that if you want to reserve the term religion to something in the past, then you've got to realize that it's a pretty narrow definition. And let's simply talk about life and the philosophy of life, because that's what I'm talking about by religion.
Yeah, we often get bunched up in what we mean by the words, and I think that many of my atheist friends and colleagues in the secular humanist movement, for example, would agree with an importance of how we as people live together how we live our lives, what we find of value, what inspires us, and how we implement positive change in the world. That's very much something that we're in agreement with. And for some, there's the term religion is attached to that. For some, spiritual. For others, none of those fits. And that's okay. We're all referring to what we do together as people. So what do you see as some of the positive benefit of that secular approach to things?
Well, it's not easy to put that in just in a few words, but
use a few words. They're free. It's okay.
Let me say this. I think the human species has reached in this century the most critical point in its survival that has ever had to face before. And that we have reached the point where the particular cultures in which we lived in the past and which gave meaning and some degree of satisfaction in life, and they are all in the process of being dissolved because we have reached a global situation where the fact that we all belong to one human race, the human Homo sapiens, is now becoming more dominant than the fact that we are British or New Zealand or American or Christian or Buddhist or Confucian or whatnot. We have received a very valuable inheritance from these, but they now must either contribute to this new global culture which is hopefully emerging, or only become museum pieces from the past. I have some hope that the human species is going to meet these crises, but it's not going to be at all easy. And that's why, as some more pessimistic prophets have said, this may be the last century of the human race, for two chief reasons. One is we're at war with one another. We're not a family. We're at war with one another. And secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, we're at war with the earth. We have interfered so severely with the natural laws of ecology and evolutionary biology that, in fact, we have become a kind of cancer in the earth, and that the earth, if we were to personalize it to some extent, the earth has to get rid of us. Now, I still try to be hopeful and optimistic in this situation, and we can only do this if we learn to become one human community. Now, there are some very hopeful signs. One is, for example, that it's only in the 20th century that we started to talk about human rights. Before that, we talked about the rights of the aristocracy or the rights of the British and so on. Now we speak about human rights. We are slowly recognizing that we belong together as one human race. And that is why the religious ideology of the future can be called humanism. That is, we believe in and value what it is to be a human being, and we value human community. And that's always more important than our own personal destiny, for example, which, of course, is naturally of great importance to each one of us. But that always has to take second place to the larger view. And in many ways, the great religious traditions really had that as the goal anyway. Islam talked about the brotherhood of man. We would call it the brotherhood and sisterhood now, but Christian talked about the kingdom of God. And Buddhists looked to a time in which they would overcome all suffering and really mean a community which was in some degree of harmony. So that's how I see our relationship to the past.
What do you think would contribute most to that creation of global community? What is it we need to do, and what is it we need to dispense with?
Well, if we have to dispense with war to begin with.
That would be a good start.
So, starting with nuclear weapons, and of course, chemical weapons, that we're concerned with at the moment. And let me put it this way. Up until 100 years ago, we rather gloried in war. That is, one of the great professions was to be a soldier. And the 20th century brought a great change to this. First of all, for example, in 1900, every government had its Minister of War. You notice how that changed to Minister of Defence. And by the end of the century, we were concerned about war itself. So that I think we are making progress. Whether we're making it fast enough is another matter, but we are making progress. So the First World War led immediately to the League of Nations. Well, it wasn't as successful as it was hoped to be. So the Second World War led to the United Nations. Well, it hasn't proved as successful as we hoped. And we are due now for a third attempt, which really means rewriting the Constitution of the United Nations so that all individuals and all nations have a reasonably equal democratic say in what the United Nations does, which at the moment, of course, they don't because of the 5 nations that have the power of veto. That is really killing the United Nations. As our own Prime Minister happened to say only 2 or 3 days ago to the United Nations. I was very, very proud of him saying that. And so I think we're ready to move to this new level. The question is, will it take a World War III before we actually do it or not? I hope that reason will prevail amongst those who make these decisions and that we may move. And the present rapprochement between Russia and America and the European powers, just a bit of a beginning towards that anyway.
Our guest today has been Sir Lloyd Geering. Sir Lloyd, thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed speaking with you today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.